In May 1565, the Ottoman Empire sent 40,000 of its best soldiers to capture a tiny island defended by 500 knights. The Turks brought 80 siege cannons, including two monsters that fired 160-pound stone balls. They expected to take Malta in 2 weeks. 4 months later, they were using their own dead comrades as sandbags. The knights were throwing human heads as cannonballs, and the moats ran red with a mixture of blood, boiling oil, and melted human fat. This wasn't just a siege. It was 4 months of the most savage, brutal, absolutely unhinged combat in military history, where both sides abandoned every rule of war and turned the island into a literal hellscape. By the end of this video, you'll understand how 500 knights and 6,000 Maltese civilians held off the greatest empire on earth, using tactics so brutal that Ottoman survivors refused to speak about what they'd seen. You'll learn why the knights started using human heads as ammunition, how they turned their own sewage into weapons, and why Turkish engineers began refusing orders to approach the walls, not from fear of death, but from fear of how they would die. This is the Siege of Malta, where medieval warfare reached its absolute peak of savagery. Let me set the stage. By 1565, the Ottoman Empire controlled most of the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, they'd conquered Hungary, besieged Vienna, dominated North Africa, and their navy ruled the seas. There was just one problem: a tiny island halfway between Sicily and Africa, held by an anachronism, the Knights Hospitaller, also called the Knights of St. John, Crusader knights who'd been kicked out of the Holy Land 300 years earlier and were now basically holy pirates raiding Muslim shipping from Malta. The knights were led by Jean de Valette, a 71-year-old French nobleman who'd spent a year as a galley slave after being captured by Barbary pirates. He spoke Arabic, Turkish, and had personally killed so many Muslims in naval battles that Ottoman mothers used his name to frighten children. When spies reported the Ottoman fleet was coming, Valette had 500 knights, maybe 6,000 Maltese militia, and 3 fortresses that engineers said couldn't hold for a week. The Ottoman force was commanded by Mustafa Pasha, who'd conquered Rhodes from these same knights 40 years earlier, and Admiral Piali Pasha with a fleet of 200 ships. They brought 40,000 men, including 6,000 Janissaries, the Ottoman elite troops, fanatical converts to Islam trained from childhood to be perfect killing machines. They also brought Dragut, the greatest pirate of the Mediterranean, who knew every weakness in Malta's defenses because he'd raided it for decades. The Turks landed on May 18, 1565, expecting quick victory. Malta had no natural resources, no water except cisterns, no food production. The knights had 3 fortresses, St. Elmo guarding the harbour, Birgu and Senglea as the main defences. St. Elmo was supposed to fall in 3 days. It held for 31 days, and what happened there set the tone for the entire siege. The Turks brought their siege guns, including 2 bronze monsters named the Basilisk and the Destroyer of Christians that could fire 160-pound stone balls. They pounded St. Elmo with 7,000 cannonballs per day. The walls began to crumble. But at night the knights didn't rest. They went out and collected the cannonballs, heated them in furnaces, and fired them back red-hot so they'd set Turkish tents and gunpowder on fire. When the walls started collapsing, the knights did something insane. They took Turkish prisoners, killed them, drained their blood, mixed it with clay and limestone to make a concrete that hardened in the gaps. When they ran out of prisoners, they used their own dead. Bodies were stuffed into breaches, covered with earth and rocks, and became part of the wall. The Turks were literally attacking fortifications made of human corpses. But here's where it gets truly savage. The knights had a secret weapon: Greek fire, the medieval napalm whose recipe is lost today. But the knights' version was special. They mixed it with human fat rendered from dead Turks, creating a substance that stuck to skin and couldn't be extinguished with water. They poured this nightmare fuel on attackers, turning men into human torches who spread fire as they ran back to their lines. The first major assault on St. Elmo came on June 3rd. The Janissaries attacked at dawn, expecting weakened defenders. Instead, they met knights who'd turned defense into an art form of cruelty. The knights had these weapons called fire hoops, wooden wheels soaked in oil and pitch, set ablaze and rolled down into packed Ottoman troops. They had primitive flamethrowers called trumpets of fire that shot jets of burning oil 30 feet. They had clay pots filled with quicklime that blinded anyone nearby when they shattered. But the most terrifying weapon was the knights themselves. These weren't normal soldiers. They were religious fanatics who believed dying in battle against Muslims guaranteed heaven. When Turks broke through walls, knights would grab them in bear hugs and jump off the walls together, using their armor's weight to ensure both died. They fought with a savagery that shocked even the Janissaries. As St. Elmo's walls crumbled, the knights developed new horrors. They filled hollow cannonballs with wildcats and fired them into Turkish trenches. Imagine digging a siege trench when suddenly a cannonball explodes next to you, releasing insane, clawing cats. They loaded cannons with chains, nails, and broken glass, turning them into giant shotguns. When they ran out of proper cannonballs, they started using heads, not skulls, fresh heads. When a Turkish soldier was killed, the knights would immediately decapitate him, load the head into a cannon, and fire it back at the Turkish lines. The psychological effect was devastating. Ottoman troops would see their comrade's head flying toward them, recognizing faces of men they'd eaten breakfast with that morning. Some heads were fitted with crude fuses and gunpowder, turning them into grotesque bombs that exploded among Turkish troops, covering survivors in their friends' remains. Dragut arrived to take command of the siege and was examining the fortifications when a cannonball bounced off a wall and stone splinters tore through his head. The greatest corsair of the Mediterranean died slowly over 4 days, his brains leaking from his shattered skull. The Turks hid his death to prevent morale collapse, but the knights knew. They could see the panic in Turkish movements. When St. Elmo finally fell on June 23rd, it had cost the Turks 8,000 men, including half the Janissaries. They found 1,500 Christian bodies, but only 9 knights were captured alive, and they were so wounded they died within hours. The Turkish commanders were horrified. If a small fort cost 8,000 men, what would the main fortresses cost? Mustafa Pasha made a fatal error. To terrorize the remaining knights, he had the bodies of St. Elmo's defenders beheaded, their hearts cut out, and their bodies crucified on wooden crosses that were floated across the harbor toward Birgu. He expected fear. Instead, Valette responded with something worse. Every Turkish prisoner in Birgu, and there were hundreds, was immediately beheaded. Valette had their heads loaded into cannons and fired back at Turkish lines, but he saved the head of the Turkish commander's lieutenant for special treatment. It was fired from the largest cannon directly into the Ottoman command tent during a staff meeting, landing on their planning table, the dead eyes staring at officers who'd known him. The siege of Birgu and Senglea became a competition in creative brutality. The Turks built a massive siege tower on ships to attack from the sea. The knights waited until it was full of troops, then fired chain shot that cut its supports, collapsing it and drowning hundreds. Turkish swimmers tried to place explosives under the walls at night. The knights poured oil on the water and set the sea itself on fire. The knights had turned their sewers into weapons. They'd channel human waste, rotting animals, and diseased corpses into containers, heat them until they were literally boiling sewage, then pour this toxic soup on climbing Ottoman troops. Men hit by this didn't just die. They developed infections that spread through Turkish camps. Dysentery and typhoid killed as many Turks as combat. In July, the Turks managed to breach Birgu's walls with a massive mine that brought down a whole section. Thousands of Turks poured through. Valet himself, 71 years old, grabbed a pike and led the countercharge. The sight of the Grand Master personally fighting inspired such ferocity that knights were seen continuing to fight with multiple arrows in their bodies, holding their own intestines in with one hand while swinging swords with the other. The breach fighting was beyond description. Men fought in tunnels of corpses, the dead piled so high that combat happened on top of bodies. The knights had a final defensive position called the Post of Death. Any knight assigned there was expected to die. They would chain themselves to the walls so they couldn't retreat, even if they wanted to. Turks had to literally dismember chained knights to get past them. The summer heat made everything worse. Bodies couldn't be buried fast enough. The island became a charnel house, with clouds of flies so thick they blocked vision. The stench was so bad that men vomited inside their helmets while fighting. Both sides were fighting in air that was literally toxic from decomposing flesh. Water supplies were contaminated with blood and corpses. Men drank wine because water meant certain death from disease. By August, both sides had abandoned any pretense of civilized warfare. The knights catapulted plague-infected corpses into Turkish camps. The Turks responded by catapulting severed heads back, sometimes with messages carved into the skulls. Soldiers weren't just killed. They were creatively mutilated as psychological warfare. Bodies were arranged in obscene positions, faces skinned off and stretched on shields, genitals cut off and stuffed in mouths. The knights developed specialized weapons for suffering. They created hollow pikes that could inject boiling oil directly into wounds. They made barbed arrows designed to tear out intestines when removed. They filled clay pots with scorpions and venomous snakes, sealing them until combat, then shattering them among Turkish troops. Imagine fighting when suddenly dozens of scorpions are crawling up your legs. The Maltese civilians were just as savage. Women would pretend to surrender to lure Turks into ambushes where children would hamstring them with knives, allowing women to beat them to death with rocks. Old men too weak to fight would throw themselves on Turkish swords to bog down attacks with their bodies. Priests blessed weapons dipped in excrement to ensure wounds would infect. In one infamous incident, the Turks captured a section of wall and planted their banner. A Maltese woman named Katerina threw her own infant child at the Turkish standard-bearer, the baby's body knocking him off the wall. She then grabbed the banner and threw herself off the wall with it rather than let it fly over Malta. The knights made her a folk hero, naming a bastion after her. The Turks tried psychological warfare. They'd torture captured knights just within sight of the walls, but out of weapon range, slowly dismembering them over hours. The knights responded by doing the same to Turkish officers, using medical knowledge to keep them alive and conscious longer. Both sides competed to see who could make death take longer and hurt more. Water became a weapon. Malta had no natural water, only rain cisterns. The knights poisoned wells in areas Turks might capture with decomposing bodies and human waste. Turks who drank it died of dysentery so violent they'd literally defecate themselves to death. The Turks tried to poison Christian water supplies with dead animals thrown by catapult. Both sides were trying to win through biological warfare. The knights knew every Turkish assault pattern, so they prepared specific horrors for each. When Turks used scaling ladders, knights would wait until the ladder was full, then pour boiling oil mixed with quicklime down it. The lime would blind climbers, while the oil burned them, causing mass falls. For siege towers, they prepared fire pots, ceramic jars filled with Greek fire that would shatter on impact, covering entire structures in unquenchable flames. August 7th saw the largest assault yet. The Turks attacked simultaneously from land and sea, throwing everything into a final push. The fighting lasted 9 hours. At one point, Turkish standards were planted on Birgu's walls, and victory seemed certain. Then Valet played his last card. He released the galley slaves, promising freedom to any who fought. 500 desperate criminals joined the battle, fighting with the fury of men with nothing to lose. The massacre was total. Turks who'd made it over the walls were pushed back into their own climbing comrades. Men fell into the moats, which were literal pools of blood, oil, and liquefied human remains. Anyone who fell in drowned in gore. Turkish officers reported men refusing to advance, not from cowardice, but from the carpet of bodies being too unstable to walk on. But here's the detail that breaks comprehension. During the worst fighting, both sides were so exhausted that combat would spontaneously stop when everyone was too tired to lift weapons. Knights and Turks would sit among corpses, sharing water, before standing up and resuming killing each other. They fought in shifts not because of strategy, but because human bodies physically couldn't sustain that level of violence continuously. The Ottoman supplies were running out. Dysentery and typhoid were killing hundreds daily. Turkish soldiers were starting to refuse orders, not from fear of death, but from fear of the ways the knights killed. Ottoman morale collapsed when rumors spread that knights were cannibals who ate Turkish hearts for strength. The rumors were false, but after 4 months of unprecedented savagery, Turkish troops believed the knights capable of anything. On September 8th, Spanish reinforcements finally arrived. Just 600 men, but the Turks thought it was thousands. Mustafa Pasha ordered retreat. The Ottoman Empire's greatest military expedition had been defeated by 500 knights and a small island. They left behind 30,000 dead. The knights had lost 250 of their 500 brothers and most of the Maltese defenders, but they'd held. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Malta was a moonscape of craters, ruins, and corpses. The cleanup took months. Bodies were so numerous they were burned in massive pyres that could be seen from Sicily. The island's soil was so contaminated with blood and human remains that nothing would grow for years. Archaeologists still find cannonballs mixed with human bones, embedded in Malta's walls. Suleiman the Magnificent was so enraged by the defeat that he prepared an even larger force to take Malta the next year. But he died before it sailed, and the Ottoman Empire never again tried to take the island. The 500 knights had broken the empire's expansion into the western Mediterranean forever. Malta became a symbol. If 500 knights could hold against 40,000 Turks, maybe the Ottoman Empire wasn't invincible. The knights rebuilt Malta into an impregnable fortress. The new capital, Valletta, named after the Grand Master, was designed so that every street could be defended, every building could become a fort. They were preparing for the next siege. It never came. The Ottomans had learned that some victories cost more than defeats. Veterans of Malta were changed men. Turkish survivors refused to speak about what they'd experienced. Knights who'd fought there were treated with an awe that bordered on fear. They'd participated in 4 months of combat so intense that normal warfare seemed like child's play afterward. Many never fought again, not from injury but from a kind of combat exhaustion that no one had seen before. The siege changed warfare. Both sides had used weapons and tactics that violated every rule of civilized combat. The use of biological warfare, psychological torture, and deliberate savagery became studied in military academies as the Malta model, what happens when both sides abandon all restraint. It was concluded that such warfare was so destructive to both sides that it must never be repeated. But the real legacy of Malta was psychological. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, had been stopped by 500 knights. The defenders had proven that determination could overcome numbers, that savagery could defeat strength, that a small force willing to do anything could defeat an empire. It was a lesson that echoed through history, from the American Revolution to Vietnam to Afghanistan. Sometimes the side willing to be more brutal wins, regardless of numbers. The Knights of Malta had turned their island into hell on earth for 4 months. They'd used human bodies as building materials, heads as ammunition, and turned the basic human need for water into a weapon. They'd violated every principle of chivalry they supposedly stood for. And they'd won. The Ottoman Empire's greatest defeat came not from a massive army, but from 500 men who decided they'd rather turn their island into an abattoir than surrender. Today, Malta's fortifications still stand, cannonballs still embedded in walls, some still containing fragments of human bone. The island is a monument to what happens when warfare abandons all limits. The siege of Malta wasn't just a military victory, it was proof that humans are capable of violence so extreme that even writing about it 450 years later feels like staring into an abyss of calculated savagery that defended Christianity through methods that would have horrified Christ. The medical aftermath revealed horrors that weren't understood for centuries. When physicians examined survivors, they found knights who'd fought for weeks with untreated broken bones that had fused incorrectly, creating grotesque deformities. Men had sword fragments embedded in their bodies that their flesh had grown around, turning them into living repositories of shrapnel. The knights' habit of fighting while severely wounded led to infections that created new diseases. One knight was found to have been fighting with gangrene, so advanced his leg was literally rotting off. He tied it to his body with rope and continued fighting for 3 days. Turkish doctors reported similar cases, including janissaries who'd gone blind from quicklime but continued fighting by sound alone, swinging at anything that spoke Maltese. The level of pain these men endured and ignored broke medical understanding of human limits. The economic cost went beyond mere numbers. The Ottoman Empire had spent the equivalent of 3 years of imperial revenue on the siege. They'd lost their best engineers, their elite janissaries, and most importantly, their reputation for invincibility. Christian slaves across the Mediterranean began revolting, believing if Malta could resist, so could they. The loss of 200 experienced naval captains at Malta crippled Ottoman naval power for a generation. Venice and Spain, seeing Ottoman weakness, became more aggressive in their Mediterranean policies. The failed siege triggered an economic cascade. Ottoman war bonds defaulted, causing financial crisis in Constantinople. The resources wasted at Malta could have conquered most of Italy. Instead, 40,000 men and millions in gold had purchased nothing but 30,000 graves on a rocky island. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy was the normalization of extreme violence among the survivors. Knights who returned to Europe brought Malta's methods with them. The use of human remains as psychological weapons spread to other conflicts. The 30 Years' War saw commanders who'd studied Malta's siege employing similar tactics: heads as ammunition, bodies as building materials, biological warfare through contaminated water. Military manuals began including sections on Malta tactics, methods considered too extreme for normal warfare, but acceptable in desperate defense. The knights had proven that any atrocity could be justified by calling it survival. European warfare became notably more brutal after 1565, as if Malta had given permission for savagery that had previously been unthinkable. The siege didn't just save Malta, it infected European warfare with a new level of acceptable brutality. But here's the ultimate irony that haunted both sides. The extreme violence had been unnecessary. Later Ottoman documents revealed Suleiman had already decided to recall the fleet if Malta hadn't fallen by September due to approaching winter storms. The knights' final desperate defenses, the last savage month of fighting, the thousands of deaths in August alone, all of it happened when the Ottomans were already planning to leave. Similarly, Spanish reinforcements had been ready for months, but delayed by bureaucracy, not distance. If they'd arrived in July, thousands of lives would have been saved. Both sides had essentially tortured each other for an extra month for no strategic reason, just momentum of violence that neither could stop. The siege had developed its own logic, where stopping seemed more impossible than continuing the slaughter. Malta proved that wars can become so savage they continue past any rational purpose, fed only by the previous atrocities demanding revenge. The most horrific month of one of history's most brutal sieges had been completely pointless. A mutual massacre that achieved nothing except proving humans could sustain inhuman violence far past any strategic necessity.